So, we're talking about evolution, and up to this point, we've really spent a lot of time discussing how natural selection can impact the way that those allele frequencies change from one generation to the next. But it's not just natural selection that plays a role in those changing allele frequencies when I'm looking at a particular population. And so, we're going to pick up today talking about a couple other mechanisms by which that sort of evolutionary or allele frequency change can occur. And one of those big ways that we can change the gene pool of a population is to allow gene flow to happen. And what that really is talking about is the movement of alleles from one population to another. So if I'm adding new alleles or taking alleles away from those populations, that's clearly going to affect the ratio of dominant alleles versus recessive alleles in that population that I'm studying. Now, one of the things that we've got to keep in mind is that it's not just this random allele that's suddenly going to show up in the population, because it really is a matter of individuals moving in or immigrating into a population or moving out of that population or emigrating, that is allowing those allele frequencies to change because those individuals are bringing that allele with them or taking it with them when they leave. So when we look at gene flow overall, it really is going to change the genetic diversity depending on whether that allele is coming in or that individual is moving in or moving out. Now, any gene flow that is moving into that population is going to naturally increase its genetic variation or its genetic diversity. And generally speaking, that's a good thing for that population to maintain its ability to stay healthy, genetically speaking. What we end up seeing, however, is when this gene flow stops. So somehow a population gets isolated from another. That lack of moving in and moving out, that lack of variation being added or taken away between those two populations can potentially cause them to evolve into different species. They can become so genetically different from each other because that flow has been stopped that we can actually get new species to show up. And that's part of why this topic shows up in evolution, because if those two populations get cut off, the gene flow stops, and the environmental influences of those two populations changes, we can get speciation, or these what used to be one species diverge into two new species now that these populations can't get to each other anymore. Genetic drift is another potential mechanism for evolution, but rather than gene flow sort of being predictable or natural selection being predictable, genetic drift causes the allele frequencies in those populations to change really from random chance. There's no real reason from a biological standpoint for why a particular allele becomes more common and why the other sort of drops off. And this only really happens when we talk about really small populations, because what ends up happening is the smaller and smaller that population is over time, you end up with such little genetic diversity that we really start talking about situations where individuals in that population, because it's so small, end up mating with relatives. And when we get to genetics, we'll talk about that sort of incest causing those recessive traits, particularly recessive traits that are harmful to these organisms, to actually sort of go up in frequency. Now, if it's a recessive trait and it's harmful, we would expect it to disappear from the population, right? If it's not doing any benefit to that individual, then they should be sort of getting weeded out of the population because those organisms shouldn't be the ones who are reproducing as often. But when we see with genetic drift, because that population is so small, that those more harmful recessive alleles actually increase instead. So when we look at how those populations can get small enough for genetic drift to actually become impactful, we really look at these two ideas of the bottleneck effect and the founder effect, and we'll talk through those in just a sec. But ultimately, genetic drift will cause the genetic diversity of those new populations to be dramatically reduced compared to where that original population started off. So let's talk about how that works, and let's look at the bottleneck effect first. So your bottleneck effect is a type of genetic drift that's going to cause the population to be dramatically reduced in its size. And it's really sort of a matter of you were in the right place at the right time, and that's why you survived. It has nothing to do with the actual physical characteristics, the actual alleles that you're carrying. And so even if that population begins to increase over time, it survives, it's able to come back from this huge event, their gene pool is severely limited. And the bottleneck effect usually happens from some sort of big natural disaster, some sort of earthquake or volcanic eruption or huge hurricane or flood, something that's going to take this population and dramatically reduce its numbers, but it's not, your survival isn't dependent on the traits that you have. It's just you happen to not be in the worst of the disaster. So if I take a look, this is sort of a classic example of how to demonstrate or illustrate this particular effect. And I look at that original parent population, and you can see that for whatever reason, that yellow trait was the most common. So presumably that was the most effective characteristic for that original population to be surviving. Now, naturally, you're going to have variations, so those blues still kind of pop up here and there. But some sort of dramatic reduction in the population occurs. Maybe it's a hurricane, and whoever just happened to be really close to the coast was the ones who got wiped out. The individuals who are further away from the coastline managed to survive. But look at the ratio of individuals who are surviving and the traits that they have. I got a drastic reduction in numbers, and it just so happened that that blue trait, which wasn't necessarily as adaptive, if I go back to that parent population, they're the ones who survived more. So I go to the next generation, and of course, those blues are going to be considerably higher in frequency, even though that's not necessarily the best trait for their environment. So that's what we're talking about with the bottleneck. Some sort of big event happens, reduces their numbers. So then when I look at the next generation or even the generation after that, the less beneficial alleles might actually be the ones that are more common, even though it's really not as beneficial when you look at it from an evolutionary standpoint. The other way that genetic drift might occur is by this idea of this founder effect. So genetic drift that occurs after a small number of individuals colonizes some new area. Once again, the gene pool of that new population dramatically is reduced. The genetic diversity is reduced. It doesn't necessarily represent the original population in terms of the genetic diversity that was present. And this is often where we see additional issues with that inbreeding. So if I take a look at this idea, here I've got a flower population. Flowers can't move. They can't pick up and walk somewhere else. So I end up with this new population. When this bird takes these couple of individuals somewhere else, gene flow's cut off, they can't get to each other, and look at the dramatic difference. So not only am I seeing a much higher frequency of yellow, which is considerably lower over here, but I don't even have the red diversity to exist at all. It doesn't happen. And we see founder effects happen a lot in animal populations when we talk about habitat disturbance. So building a highway could dramatically cut gene flow off, separate a small portion of a population. Think of 78, right? If we talk about deer being able to cross that, it's really hard for them to get there unless they find an avenue underneath the highway. So we're creating these subset populations that may not necessarily be as genetically diverse as the population used to be before that disturbance occurred. So overall, the effects, whether you're talking bottleneck effect or founder effect, the overall effects of genetic drift are relatively the same. Population's going to lose its genetic variation, and if they lose that genetic variation, especially if the variation necessary for their survival gets decreased, the trait that they needed to survive isn't as frequent, then any changes in those environments may cause that population to be less likely to adapt. AKA, if it's bad enough, they may end up going extinct. As well as the alleles that are lethal in your homozygous individuals, particularly your homozygous recessive individuals. They get carried around by those heterozygotes, right? They're the ones who are going to show the dominant trait, but have the recessive trait in their genetics. Well, they may be the ones who end up reproducing more often because they're the ones who are surviving. And so that's how that increase in recessive traits can happen, not because that recessive trait is necessarily any more beneficial, but if all I'm stuck with is a bunch of heterozygotes, well, I now have a 1 in 4 chance of having somebody who's homozygous recessive. And so that's how they can become more common simply by chance, not really because natural selection is choosing to increase that recessive characteristic.